Hey everyone and welcome to the show. Ever feel like life just completely broke you, like you're trying to put the pieces back together, but some are just missing?
Yeah.
Well, that's what Dr. Laura Williams tackles in her book, What to Do When You Feel Broken.
It's a really interesting blend of memoir and self-help.
Definitely. And if you're looking for insights into healing and self-discovery,
Make sure to like and subscribe.
yes, we've got a deep dive for you today.
And what I find so compelling is how Dr. Williams starts with her own story. Like right at the beginning, the book opens with the sudden death of her husband.
Wow.
Yeah, and she's so raw and honest about her journey through grief. By the way, you can find the link to buy the book on Amazon in the show notes.
It's powerful because it reminds us that even clinical psychologists, the people who help others process trauma,
Right.
they experience their own struggles too.
Yeah, and Dr. Williams really doesn't shy away from that vulnerability at all.
Not one bit.
And through her own experiences, she highlights this idea of psychological mindedness.
Okay, what is that?
So it's not just about understanding your thoughts and feelings, but it's understanding the why behind them.
Oh, the why.
Yeah, like why do I react this way? Where did these patterns come from?
So it's like she's saying self-awareness is the key that unlocks the door to healing.
Exactly.
But it's not always easy to find that key, is it?
You're telling me. And that's where some of these core psychological concepts come in that she weaves into the book, like attachment theory, for example.
Okay, now I'll admit attachment theory always sounded kind of intimidating to me.
Oh, yeah,
But the way Dr. Williams breaks it down, it's actually really accessible.
totally.
So basically it's about how our early relationships, from childhood,
Yeah.
shape our adult relationships.
Right, and how those early experiences can sometimes lead to unhealthy patterns later on.
Oh, that makes sense.
She gives a great example with the story of Amy, one of her clients,
Okay.
who was struggling with body image and eating disorders.
It's so common.
Yeah. And Amy felt like her needs weren't important growing up, and those early experiences were directly impacting her ability to, care for herself as an adult.
It's amazing how much our childhood can influence us, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And it's not just about the major events either. Dr. Williams really emphasizes how those everyday experiences can be just as shaking.
The little things.
Exactly. And that brings us to social learning theory,
Okay?
which is this idea that we learn by observing and imitating people around us.
Makes sense.
And Dr. Williams uses her own family history as an example, showing how patterns of anxiety and perfectionism were passed down through generations, like a legacy almost.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so we see her grandmother's focus on outward appearances, her mother's struggle with people-pleasing, and how those patterns eventually show up in Dr. Williams' own life.
Makes you think about what we might be unknowingly passing down, doesn't it?
Definitely gives you pause. And speaking of patterns, Dr. Williams dedicates a whole chapter to perfectionism,
Ooh, perfectionism.
which she describes as a double-edged sword.
How so?
Well, on one hand, it can drive us to achieve amazing things, right?
Yeah.
But on the other, it can leave us feeling constantly inadequate and afraid of failing.
It's so true.
And she really dives into the different types of perfectionism and how to recognize them in ourselves.
I didn't realize there were different types.
There are, self-oriented, other-oriented, and socially prescribed. It's really fascinating.
Oh,
And what I appreciate is she even shares her own struggles with perfectionism,
wow.
which makes it so relatable. It's not just some clinical concept. It's something she's personally dealt with.
That makes a big difference.
And that honesty really shines through in her discussion of shame as well.
Shame is a tough one
Yeah, she doesn't just define it, she talks about how it feels to be trapped by it.
to really experience it.
Exactly, and what I found really insightful was how she distinguishes between shame and guilt.
Okay, so what's the difference?
So guilt is about feeling bad for a specific action,
Okay.
but shame is about feeling bad about yourself as a whole person.
Oh, that's a good distinction.
It's that feeling of I'm not good enough versus I did something wrong.
Right.
And she shares this powerful story about an inmate in prison,
Wow.
yeah, who's struggling with this intense shame over his past actions.
Oh, gosh.
It really drives home how debilitating shame can be and how it can prevent us from moving forward.
Yeah, for sure.
But she doesn't just leave us there. She offers tools for combating shame, like practicing self-compassion and challenging those negative inner voices.
Love that. Self-compassion is so important.
Totally. It's about treating yourself with the same kindness and understanding that you would offer a friend.
Absolutely.
It's a muscle we have to build, though, especially when we're so used to being self-critical.
It really is. And speaking of relationships, Dr. Williams introduces this tool called relational formulation to help us understand our patterns in relationships.
It's a good one.
I love this part.
Me too.
It's all about mapping out your key relationships
Uh-huh.
and looking for recurring themes. Like, do you always find yourself as the caregiver?
Right.
or the rescuer.
Exactly.
It helps you see those unconscious patterns that might be holding you back.
From truly fulfilling connections.
Yes.
And she even gives an example from her own life, like wondering if her own parenting style might unintentionally influence her kids in certain ways.
It's a good reminder that we all have these blueprints that we carry with us, right?
Yeah,
And sometimes those blueprints need a little renovation.
for sure. And that's where her concept of powerful, imperfect living comes in.
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah. It's about accepting ourselves, flaws and all,
Yeah.
and embracing those imperfections as opportunities for growth.
It's such a liberating idea, isn't it?
Totally. Like, instead of striving for some impossible ideal,
Right.
we can just focus on living authentically
Yeah.
and finding happiness right now in this moment. Imperfections and all.
I love that. And she gives readers this simple framework called HEAL to guide them.
Oh, yeah.
What does that stand for?
So it stands for highlight the significant experiences of your life. Engage with your reality fully to make sense of it.
Okay.
Attune to your feelings related to those experiences. And finally, let it lift.
Let it lift. I love this.
It's a good one, right?
It's a reminder that we don't have to carry the weight of our past forever.
Exactly. So as we move into the next part of our deep dive, I'm curious, what's resonating with you the most so far?
What's standing out?
Yeah.
I think what struck me most is how much Dr. Williams emphasizes the power of storytelling in healing. She believes that sharing our experiences, even the painful ones, can help us make sense of them and move forward.
Yeah. It's like giving a voice to those unspoken parts of ourselves.
Right?
The parts that might be holding us back.
Exactly.
And in a way, it connects us to a larger human experience, reminds us we're not alone.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that vulnerability isn't weakness, it's strength.
I like that.
And speaking of strength, in the next part of our deep dives, we'll explore how Dr. Williams tackles post-traumatic growth.
Okay.
The impact of early childhood experiences and strategies for managing difficult emotions. Stay tuned.
Can't wait.
Welcome back to our deep dive into what to do when you feel broken. Before the break, we were talking about these relational patterns
Yeah.
and how they can sometimes hold us back. But what about when those patterns come from something deeper, something like trauma?
That's a great question, and this is where things get really interesting. So Dr. Williams doesn't just limit trauma to those big, capital T events like abuse or natural disasters.
Right.
She actually expands the definition
Okay.
to include those smaller, more everyday experiences, things that can still leave a mark on us.
So it's not just those huge events, but also like
Right.
the constant criticism from a parent,
Exactly.
feeling neglected, or maybe witnessing conflict in your family?
Yeah, those things might not make headlines,
True.
but they can definitely shape how we see the world and ourselves.
Yes.
And Dr. Williams argues that these small T traumas can really contribute to that feeling of being broken, even if we haven't experienced like a major traumatic event.
It's like trauma exists on a spectrum,
Exactly.
and these smaller things can still have a big impact.
Right. And she also talks about these flashbulb memories. Have you ever heard of those?
Flashbulb memory.
Yeah, like those vivid, detailed memories we have of certain events.
Hmm.
And it's not always the big events that stick with us,
That's so true.
Sometimes it's a seemingly small moment, but it has this huge emotional charge.
It's like a time machine for our feelings almost.
Exactly. They can be positive or negative, but those flashbulb memories, they tend to be really deeply ingrained, and then they can get triggered by seemingly random things,
Yeah.
bringing those past emotions right back up to the surface.
Like a certain smell or song will take you right back to a specific moment.
Yes, exactly.
And suddenly you're feeling all those things again.
And that's where Dr. Williams introduces this concept of post-traumatic growth.
Okay.
Which might seem counterintuitive at first.
How can trauma lead to growth? It seems like the opposite.
I know, right?
It's a contradiction.
Yeah, but she argues that facing adversity and processing those tough experiences can actually lead to a deeper appreciation for life,
Okay.
stronger relationships, and even increased resilience.
So it's like you've gone through the fire and come out stronger.
Exactly.
Okay, I could see that.
And she gives this great example of a client named Jo,
Okay.
who lost her husband really suddenly.
Oh, gosh.
And at first she tried to just suppress all her emotions.
Avoid it.
Yeah, which was a coping mechanism she learned in childhood.
Oh, wow.
But through therapy, she started to understand those patterns, and she allowed herself to actually grieve.
Do you feel it?
Yeah, and through that process of confronting her grief, she discovered this strength and resilience she never knew she had.
Wow, that's powerful.
Right? It's a reminder that sometimes we have to go through those dark times to find the light.
So it's not about ignoring the pain.
No.
But finding a way to integrate it into our story so we can move forward.
Exactly. And Dr. Williams really stresses the importance of acknowledging all our emotions, even the messy, uncomfortable ones.
Like just letting ourselves feel them.
Exactly. Like being present with those feelings and understanding where they're coming from, not judging ourselves for having them.
No judgment.
And she even provides a script for emotional attunement,
Was that?
which is all about being mindful of our feelings without getting completely swept away by them.
Okay.
Like observing the emotion with curiosity instead of getting totally lost in it.
That makes sense. So it ties back to that mindfulness idea,
Yeah.
creating space between ourselves and our reactions.
Right, so we can make conscious choices about how to respond.
I like that. But sometimes the past can feel really heavy.
Yeah, especially when we're talking about things like intergenerational trauma.
Intergenerational trauma.
Yeah, it's basically how trauma can be passed down through families.
Oh, wow. So it's like inheriting a legacy of pain almost.
It really is. And Dr. Williams explores how patterns of relating coping mechanisms and even psychological disorders can be influenced by our family history.
So it's not just our own experiences, but our ancestors' experiences too.
Exactly. And she uses her own family as an example,
Okay.
showing how the anxiety and perfectionism present in her grandmother and mother also showed up in her own life.
Makes you wonder, how do we break those cycles?
Such a good question. And Dr. Williams suggests that awareness is the first step.
Okay.
Like by understanding our family history and our own patterns, we can start to make choices that interrupt those cycles.
So it's like shining a light on those unconscious patterns
Yeah,
and saying, hey, I see you and I'm not going to let you run the show anymore.
exactly. And then it's about building what she calls a trauma toolkit.
A trauma toolkit.
Yeah, which is like a set of coping skills and strategies for managing those difficult emotions and situations that might trigger those old patterns.
So what kinds of things are in this toolkit?
Well, she talks about things like mindfulness exercise, spending time in nature, connecting with supportive people.
The good stuff.
Yeah, it's about having a toolbox full of resources that can help us navigate the tough times.
I like that a lot. What about relational trauma?
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
What is that exactly?
So it's trauma that specifically occurs within relationships.
Okay.
And this one can be really tricky because it's often subtle and it might go unnoticed for years.
So it's not always about like the big betrayals or abuse.
Right, it can be those more insidious things like feeling constantly criticized or controlled.
Oh, I see.
And Dr. Williams explains how those unhealthy patterns can really impact our emotional well-being and our ability to form secure attachments.
And those secure attachments are so important.
They are. And she emphasizes how important it is to understand our attachment style.
Attachment style.
Yeah. It's basically how we relate to others in close relationships.
Okay.
And our early childhood experiences play a huge role in shaping our attachment style.
Right.
And that style can influence everything from our romantic relationships to our friendships to even our relationship with ourselves.
It's fascinating how much our past can affect our present, isn't it?
Totally. But the good news is Dr. Williams doesn't just diagnose the problem, she offers solutions.
Okay, good.
She talks about how to identify those unhealthy attachment patterns and build more secure and fulfilling relationships.
I love that. So there's hope.
Oh, yeah, tons of hope. And she also talks about how traditional therapy, like cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT,
Yeah.
can sometimes be limited when it comes to addressing these deep-rooted relational issues.
It can't fix everything.
Right, like CBT can be great for managing symptoms and challenging negative thoughts.
Yeah.
But it doesn't always get to the root of those thoughts and behaviors.
I see.
So Dr. Williams advocates for a more holistic approach that includes relational and attachment-based therapies.
What are some examples of those?
Things like schema therapy and cognitive analytical therapy,
Okay.
which really focus on understanding our relationship patterns and developing healthier ways of relating.
So you're really getting to the core of the issue.
Exactly. And she shares this amazing story about a client named Megan,
Okay.
who was struggling with anxiety and depression after a really traumatic birth experience with her twin daughters.
Oh, wow.
And it turned out that a past trauma from her childhood, her parents' divorce, is actually being triggered by this current event.
It all connects.
It does, and Megan's experience really highlights how those unresolved wounds from the past can resurface in unexpected ways.
That's so true.
And it shows how crucial it is to understand our attachment style and address those early wounds in order to heal and move forward.
It's a process.
It is, but Megan's story is such a powerful reminder that healing is possible, even when those wounds run deep.
It's inspiring, isn't it?
Totally. And in the next part of our deep dive, we'll explore some of the specific tools and techniques Dr. Williams offers for healing and creating a more fulfilling life. So stay tuned.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been talking about Dr. Laura Williams' book, What to Do When You Feel Broken. And so far, we've really journeyed through understanding our past, our patterns, the impact of those small traumas.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, what about the healing part? Like, what tools does she actually give us to put ourselves back together?
Well, one of the most powerful tools she talks about is something we often overlook, and that's the power of telling our own stories.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, she even has a whole chapter dedicated to it.
It makes sense, though, right? Because those small traumas are often about the things we don't talk about,
Right.
the experiences we bury or try to minimize. So
Exactly.
maybe speaking our truth is a big part of healing.
It really is. It's about acknowledging those experiences, both good and bad,
Yeah,
and making them part of who we are. And it doesn't have to be, this huge dramatic thing.
right.
Dr. Williams encourages us to be curious and compassionate as we explore our
To
stories.
start small.
Yeah, and find what feels safe.
So it could be journaling or talking to a therapist
Mm-hmm.
or even just confiding in a friend.
Exactly. Just finding a way to give a voice to those parts of ourselves that haven't been spoken.
Right. And to help make sense of those stories, she brings back the relational formulation idea.
Oh, yeah.
Remember that, mapping out the key relationships
Yeah.
and looking for patterns.
It's so helpful.
It is. So it's not just telling the story, but also analyzing it
Right.
and looking for those themes that might be contributing to our struggles today.
Exactly. Like, are we always the peacemaker?
Yeah.
Do we keep attracting partners who need to be rescued?
It's about seeing those patterns so we can break free.
Exactly. And Dr. Williams uses her own family relationships as an example. She talks about how patterns of control and criticism were passed down for generations.
Wow.
Almost like an inheritance, that no one asked for.
That's a powerful way to put it.
It makes you realize how important it is to set boundaries and build healthy relationships as adults,
Yeah, you can't change your past, but you can change how you relate to people now.
for sure. And speaking of challenging patterns, she dives into the concept of shame.
Hey, that's a tough one.
It is, and she describes it as that feeling of being inherently bad or unworthy.
Ugh,
It's the kind of feeling that keeps us stuck and prevents us from getting help.
because it tells us we don't deserve it?
Yeah, exactly. Like we're not worthy of love or connection.
Right, we put up a wall.
And to combat that shame, she encourages us to practice self-compassion.
Oh, I love that.
It's about being kind to ourselves,
Yes,
treating ourselves with the same understanding we'd offer a friend.
absolutely.
It means challenging those negative voices and replacing them with messages of acceptance and grace.
It's not easy.
No, it's not. And this ties back into that powerfully imperfect living idea.
I love that concept.
It's about embracing our imperfections, seeing them as part of what makes us unique.
Instead of trying to be perfect.
Exactly. And Dr. Williams walks the talk. She shares her own struggles with imperfection
Oh, that's great.
and how it's led to more happiness and fulfillment in her life.
It's inspiring
And she challenges us to define success on our own terms.
to think about what truly matters to us.
What brings us joy?
It's about creating a life that feels meaningful, even with all the challenges and setbacks.
Yeah, and that includes taking care of ourselves.
Self-care.
Yes, both physically and emotionally. And Dr. Williams talks about how stress and trauma can show up in physical symptoms.
It's all connected.
It is, so she offers a bunch of strategies for managing stress.
Like what?
Things like exercise, being in nature, mindfulness, connecting with loved ones.
All good things.
It's about finding what works for you and creating a self-care routine that nourishes your well-being.
That's so important.
And I think her own story, her journey of healing and growth after losing her husband,
It's so powerful.
it really is. It's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit.
It gives people hope.
Absolutely, that even in those really dark times, healing is possible.
So what to do when you feel broken? It's more than just a self-help book.
It really is.
It's like a guide to understanding ourselves, our patterns.
And the power we have to change our stories.
It reminds us that we're not alone in our struggles.
That even when we feel broken, we can heal and create a life that feels meaningful.
Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive into Dr. Laura Williams' book.
It was a pleasure.
It really was insightful. And we would love to hear from you. What resonated with you most? What were your aha moments? Share your thoughts in the comments below.